The title is Quantum Brain Dynamics and Holography.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for giving me a chance to talk about our research. The title is Quantum Brain Dynamics and Holography. This work is collaboration with Professor Tanaka in Kobe University and Professor Tsujinsky in University of Alberta. First of all, we have a question. What is the physical mechanism of memory in the brain? Memory have several properties different from computer memory. First, sequential patterns. When we recall a song or melody, song and melody are recalled in the forward direction, not the backward directions. This is a sequential patterns. Second, auto-associative recalling. When the part of information is given, we can recall the total memory, whole memory auto-associatively. Third, patterns in the hierarchy. Memory is in patterns in hierarchy. Visual information propagates from V1, V2, V4 with information processing. Memory is recorded in the patterns in the hierarchy. Fourth, memory is patterns in invariant forms. For example, we take a cup and drink a tea. This action is different every time, but we recognize this action as a single invariant manner. This is an invariant form patterns. Next, non-locality in memory is suggested by experiments. Lashley suggested memory is non-locally diffused in the whole region in the brain. In the experiment for the rat maze, first letting rats learn the task of maze. Next, cutting out the portion of the brain. Third, retest. The result is any memory for the rat maze is not lost by cutting out any particular portions. In the Pribram experiments, cutting out a portion for the brain for the treatment after the operation, any memory is not selectively lost, so the memory is diffused in the whole regions in the brain. To describe the properties of the memory, Carl Pribram proposed the holographic brain theory. Holography invented by Carl. Holography is a technology to record and reconstruct a three-dimensional image. We set the laser light described in this figure. We shall split the laser light in two pathways. First is reflected by the mirror reference wave. The second is reflected by the object waves. The reference wave and object waves are interfered on the holograms. Interference patterns of the holograms. Hologram records the amplitude information and phase informations. We cannot find what is recorded in these holograms, but by applying the reference wave in the same angle as the recording, we can reconstruct the original object images. We shall split, breaking out the holograms in this way. By parts of the holograms, we can reconstruct the whole image from the parts of the holograms. We can describe the experimental result by Lashley by removing out the cortical parts, but we can reconstruct the whole image by the remaining parts of the holograms. And next, by changing the angles of the laser light, multiple memory can be recorded on the same surface. We can describe the huge capacity of memory in the brain. The collaborators with the hologram Pribram is Jibu and Yasuya. They proposed a hypothesis of memory, quantum brain dynamics. They provided the concrete degrees of freedom of quantum plane dynamics. The degrees of freedom are water dipoles and photons. QBD is a quantum field theory of water dipoles and photons. Quantum degrees of freedom might play a role of memory formation around microtubules in the cells. Quantum plane dynamics by GV and SA is different from Penrose-Hameroff approach or different from the approach. Quantum plane dynamics by GV SA is originated with the Richard and Meza in 1967. We shall see the water molecules. Total charge of the water molecules is 0, but it is locally polarized, plus and minus charges. It is written by the vector. In the normal waters, the directions of the water molecules are random, but under the specific conditions, phase transition occurs. Dipoles are aligned in the same directions. This direction is a special direction. This is a breakdown of rotational symmetry, or macroscopic order. This macroscopic order is maintained by the massless non-Boson quantum. Stability of vacuum is achieved by this long-range correlation of the massless non-Boson quantum. This coherent state, vacuum, corresponds to the memory storage, and finite number excitations, photons, on the vacuum represents the memory retrieval in quantum plane dynamics. So, how do we proceed our research in the next step? First strategy is a squeezed coherent state in open systems. Squeezed coherent states are infinite number of states, have infinite number of states. So each squeezed coherent state represents each memory. Huge memory capacity is realized by the infinite number of squeezed coherent states. Or second strategy is a holography of ionic bioplasma. By using the boson mode for the ions, we can describe the holography. Carl Pribram proposed. But our strategy is the integration of the quantum plane dynamics and holography. The purpose of this talk is a solution for the coherent photon emission, super-radiance, for the interference patterns of the holography, and propose the integration of quantum plane dynamics and holography. The model of the quantum plane dynamics is described in this figure. The Lagrangian density is the photon degrees of freedom, electromagnetic fields, and water dipoles, and interactions. Water dipole Lagrangian is described by dipole fields. Psi star. Star represents a complex conjugate, and psi. Time derivatives and translational motion of the water dipoles, x, y, z directions, and rotational motion of the water dipoles. We shall consider the dipole moment 2ED and the orientation of the dipoles in the polar coordinate. The interaction Lagrangian is 2ED and orientation of the dipoles and inner product with the electric fields. We set the two-energy level approximation for the rotational motion of the dipoles. Angular momentum 0, this is a ground state. Angular momentum 2, this is a first excited state. 2ED is the orientation and the inner product of electric field. It is described by the mu I and EI. Mu I represents the dipole density vector. Mu1 is the dipole vector in the x1 direction. Mu2, mu3 is described by x2 and x3 directions. x3 component is described by the combination of the ground state and first excited states. We can consider the population difference. Population in the first excited state in this area and ground state. The difference is described by squared values. The energy difference is 4 milli-electron volt in two-energy level approximation. The time evolution of the coherent dipole fields is described by Schrödinger-like equation. For the ground state, time derivative of the ground state is the first excited state time electric fields. It's not difficult. This is just a product. The time derivative of the first excited states is the electric field and ground state. The second equation is the Klein-Gordon equation for the electric fields, time derivative squared, and Laplacian, and E3 is described as mu3, and population difference and electric field, and their quantum fluctuations. Quantum fluctuation represents the incoherent dipole excitations. We can derive the super-radiance solution from the Schrödinger-like equation and Klein-Gordon equation. Super-radiance is anisotropic, one-dimensional photon emission. This is a cooperative, ultra-efficient photon spontaneous emission. By observing with the detector, some kind of peaks of the super-radiance light emission is observed. The typical time scale is tau. Tau R is proportional to 1 over number of dipoles, 1 over n time scales. N dipoles decay 1 over n time scales. The intensity is n squared instantly. Ultra-efficient, strong photon emission is achieved. The typical time scale is 0.2 picosecond when we consider the microtubules as a device of the source of the super-radiance emission. The electric field maximum value is 480 megavolt per meter. We shall consider the structure of the microtubules. Its inner diameter is 15 nanometers, and length is 1 to 10 micrometers. The wavelength is of the super-radiance light is 310 micrometers. This is the energy difference for millielectron photon in the two energy level approximation. This wavelength is larger than the inner diameter. Diffraction occurs for the super-radiance light. So the propagation in the wide range is achieved in the super-radiance light. This super-radiance light is reflected by the object. Then, next step is the holography. Reflected by the object, super-radiance light, and reference waves without reflection. There are several interference patterns achieved. Memory splitting is the interference between the reference and object waves. Interference of the electric field changes the transmission. Transmission T is proportional to 1 over population difference. It is written the electric field squared. Electric field squared is reference wave and object wave squared. It is written by these whole terms. Memory recalling is a reference wave is applied on the holograms. This means transmission T times the reference wave. Multiplying T by R, electric field is described by this equation. This OR squared represents a reconstructed image in the memory recalling in holography. Next, we consider the energy supply in open systems. Life is in the flow of energy. There is a continuous energy supply from the upstream to downstreams. We consider the incoherent photon energy supply coming from the upstreams. Photon comes in. Incoherent dipoles in the ground state is excited to the first excited state. Dipoles in the first excited state decays to the ground state. Then electric field is amplified. Next, how the interference patterns of the electric field is amplified. This is the initial condition of arbitrary interference patterns at 0 picosecond initial conditions. After 5 picoseconds, the waveform is maintained, but scale is different. This is a 1.5 megavolt per meter, but 8 megavolt per meter. Scale is different, but waveform is preserved. 6 picosecond, 7 picosecond. Scale is different, but waveform is maintained, but still increasing. Next, we shall consider the dipole moment density, mu3, or the collective dipole behaviors at the 7 picosecond. This is negatively aligned and positively aligned in this position. We can see mu3 is a similar form of the electric field. So the dipoles are proportional to the electric fields. Next, we shall consider the population difference, Z0 at 7 picosecond. mu3 is aligned in the negative directions. So the Z has a peaks, positive peaks. mu3 is a positive peaks, then the Z is has positive peaks. Then transmission T is described by 1 over population difference. It is proportional to mu3 squared, or E3 squared. They are proportional. Since E3 squared is written by object wave and reference wave squared, so the hologram image is recorded and amplified. In open systems, initial small but non-zero electric field is amplified by the energy supply by incoherent photons. We shall consider the super-radiance light interference patterns around the microtubes. Several interference patterns are emerging. Interference patterns of object and reference wave of E is amplified due to the energy supply. This is might be
Nishiyama-san, you have just a few minutes left, please.
Okay. Memory, this might be memory printing around microtubules. We shall consider the why waveform is maintained. This is because of the Laplacian in the Crown-Gordon equation. Laplacian plays a role of error corrections, some kind of waveforms, if the curvature is small. In this case, electric field is more rapidly increasing. If the curvature is large, electric field, increase of the electric field becomes moderate, waiting for the growth of the other parts of the electric fields. So conclusion and the perspectives. We have proposed the integration of quantum brain dynamics and holography. Starting with the Lagrangian density of QBD, we have derived the time evolution equation for the coherent dipole fields and electric fields. We can solve the solution of super-radiance for the holography. We investigated how the interference patterns in the hologram memory evolves in the presence of energy supply. Ordered patterns in the hologram are amplified due to the energy supply. Holography in QBD can describe several properties of the memory of the brain, different from the computer memory. The integration of QBD and holography may provide a promising approach. Thank you for listening.
Our next speaker is Julia Mossbridge. She is from the University of San Diego and the Institute for Love and Time. And her presentation is a retrocausal effect in photons that mimics predictive anticipatory activity in humans.
Hi, thank you. Let's see, I thought we had 20 minutes, so I'm going to try to speed through, but also try to communicate. So we'll see how we go. So what is going on with seemingly retrocausal effects? I've been studying things that are called precognition experiments in biology and psychology. And in those experiments, you basically do three things. You record data, you make a choice, or you have your software make a choice, and you look at what happened when you recorded the data, and you see if there's any relationship between those data that you recorded before the choice and the choice itself. The answer is there does seem to be a relationship. Here's an example of one such relationship. You can see in this experiment where people were going at the vertical line at 0 seconds, where people learned whether they were correct or incorrect about a random choice. Prior to that time, their physiology ramped up if they were about to be correct and did not ramp up if they were to be incorrect. This is just one trial with 30 people, but not convincing, shouldn't convince you in any way. But a bunch of people have done a bunch of experiments since the late 70s until now, where it looks like that's happening. And if you want to learn more about that, you can get all the papers at that URL at the base. So in physics, there's some experiments that look similar in the sense that, well, they're called delayed choice and similar experiments in physics, but they're not exactly the same. In those experiments, you don't record data. You have your software make a choice, and then you infer what must have happened in the first place before the choice based on what you know about physics. So slightly different. So the explanation often, at least among quantum computing folks, for those kind of phenomena is that we live in these branching universe. Each choice branches off these two possible futures, and everything's self-consistent, because if the cat dies, then of course the cat was dead before the choice, let's say. And if the cat is alive, the cat was alive. But you're not looking back at the actual area before the choice. What you're doing is inferring. And what we have here is an opportunity to look at the time before the choice. We're essentially collapsing the wave function prior to the choice. And so when we see a correlation between that information and the choice, something different is going on than is suspected by most physicists, I think. So I started thinking about the double slit experiment, because who doesn't when they're thinking about such things? And in that experiment, you've got a low level light source that, let's say, is putting one, in this case, photon at a time through a double slit, and you get an interference pattern on a screen. So what we assume in our high school and college physics classes is that the single photon goes through both slits at once. Okay, so it's sort of mysterious and non-local in space. But what do we really observe? We observe that the lamp is on for a duration and we get an interference pattern. We're inferring this non-locality in space. It's a good explanation. We'd actually, once you try to get evidence for it, it's pretty tricky. I'm not going to go there right now. And I'm just going to ask, what if it was non-local in time instead of space? So what if you have a just emitted photon and you have a not yet emitted photon, and one is going through one slit and one is going through other slit, and you have an interference pattern? It's perfectly reasonable, also crazy, like most quantum ideas. It comes straight from Feynman quantum electrodynamics. A time-traveling photon could be absorbed before it's emitted. So what would that look like in an experiment? So let's assume that you have a light source on for either a short duration, a medium duration, or a long duration. Let's assume all photons are available to be absorbed, including those not yet emitted at a particular present, including those that are not yet even stimulated out of the interactions in the photomultiplier. You would have these three piles of sand representing the different amounts of photons. Now, cut off everything but the first, 1 minute of time, and compare the piles. Notice how they would be different, right? You would see different amounts of photons representing the piles. Now, this, if you think too carefully about this, you're going to realize this is an absolute error in thinking. So don't think too carefully about it, because what I'm doing is explaining why I did this experiment. I'm not telling you that this thinking is correct. I did this experiment because my thinking was incorrect, but it got me to an interesting place. So here's what we've got. Before in our precognition experiments, we recorded the data, we took a choice, and we looked at what happened in one. In our usual delayed choice experiments, don't record the data, make a choice, and then infer what happened in one. We're going to change that to something I'm going to call an ambiguous causality experiment. We're getting rid of that line, because now the top and the bottom are exactly the same steps. We're going to record the data, make a choice, and look at what happened in one. The recording of the data is, in this case, is going to be photon counts. The choice is going to be the future duration of the light source. So the light source is going to be switched on and off by software, and it's going to be selected from a pool of, let's say, 4 possible durations by a quantum multiplied by a pseudo ring, random number generator. And then you're going to look at what happened in one. So that's what I did. And it looks like this, and I'm not going to go through that. I'm going to save some time by saying, I'll give you the link to download the paper and you can look at that. This is what it looked like in the closet of my office. So that's the bookshelf. And basically, I just do have to say a couple things. There's 15-watt bulb at the left end. There's a photo multiplier at the right end, and it's sending photon counts into my little MacBook, my old MacBook white computer on the floor, as it goes along this process, before the choice and after the choice. And the crank you see on the right-hand side there, that's real. I did not have a lot of resources when I set up this experiment, so I worked with an engineer who made a literal crank with a rubber ratchet to turn up and down the voltage slowly. This has now been replicated by someone who had better equipment. I'll tell you about that briefly. So in the pilot experiment, I used a double slit because I was interested in explaining this phenomenon. And the empty circles are the means of the runs, the experimental runs at each of those 4 different possible durations that were randomly selected from. The Poisson rate, let's just say that's equivalent to the number of photons that were observed in each 11-second interval. And I'm sorry, in each 1 minute prior to the choice, sorry about that. And then the filled means are after the choice. So you can see there's this progression going up, and the lines there are just showing statistically significant comparisons. I changed my analysis a little bit when I did the actual experiment. I also changed it to a single slit. I actually came to this conference and talked to Roger Penrose, and I told him about the experiment. He said, well, you might as well just use a single slit. You're not actually using the double slit, and it confuses the interpretation. And I was like, I wish I was also that smart. So I decided to use a single slit. And I'll show you 3 experiments and their combination, but essentially the mean photomultiplier output is at the left. The observation number, pre and post decision, is on the x-axis, and the dotted line is the time of the duration decision, the duration of the on time of the light source. So interestingly, like, look at the yellow. Before the decision is made, the software makes the random decision about how long the light source is going to be on in the future. It's lining up to be continuous with this future line. Okay, that could be by chance, right? And in fact, looking at the different durations, you might think, well, this is just some chance issue. So I decided to make sure I did 2 things. 1, I want to show you the error bars. And 2, I want to baseline everything to the mean output before the decision for each day. I ran 50 trials a day because the crank was really loud and I couldn't sleep with it. So I didn't run it at night. This becomes important later. Anyway, so you can see now that I'm baselining to the mean output because of the variability across days. You can still see the differences. It's much less clear in this first experiment. Second experiment looks like this. Third experiment looks like this. What you see consistently through these experiments are duration sorting. Each of these durations are sorted according to the actual duration. The photon counts are consistently different across time, not just before, but after. This is a mystery. I have ideas about it. But in any case, you put them together and they look like this. And then you can do several kinds of analyses on them statistically to find out, are these really different or not before the choice is made? And do those differences correlate with the future output? And the answer is yes, you get a 5 to 6 sigma result. Winthrop Williams at UC Berkeley, who runs the advanced physics lab there, came to a talk of mine once and said, I would like to use our equipment in the lab just to run this in the background while the students are doing their thing. I said, great. So he ran it for an entire year. I only ran it during the day. He ran it at night and day. He ran it through every season. He gets about a sigma of 5.5. When he analyzes the data in a different way, he gets around a lower sigma. And it's a way that I am talking with him about now. So that's interesting. If you want to read the paper that describes the methods, the results, the implications, go to that URL. And just be aware, this is not a peer-reviewed paper yet. It's in a preprint form. I submitted it even just to the archive, which you're supposed to be able to submit anything to. And they were like, oh, we don't know about this crazy talk. And so they kicked it back to me. So I said, well, I'll put it on ResearchGate and we'll see what happens to it. As a person who's not trained in physics, I can tell you that writing the paper in physics is a challenge. I'm trained in cognitive neuroscience and psychophysics, which, by the way, psychophysics not so related to physics. And so, so we'll see what happens with it. But I can tell you that there are multiple mysteries. I'm calling this thing, this phenomenon, causally ambiguous duration sorting, or CADS. There's multiple mysteries here that need to be solved. There's this post-choice duration-dependent photon count differences. What do I mean? I mean, even after that, forget the correlation between pre and post, even after that time of the duration decision, these durations are sorting out almost as if the photons are labeled according to which group they belong to, almost as if duration is a key parameter that defines reality that we don't even think about. Which is fascinating to me. If this continues to hold up, and these data are from like 2019, and I've been doing this experiment in my office ever since. And the one consistent result is the pre and post relationship and these duration sorting. I mean, it just keeps happening. So, so I kind of start thinking that we could eventually, or here's my leap, we could eventually use the first part of the existence of a planet, say the gravitational curvature around a planet, the space-time curvature around a planet, to determine how long it's going to exist. I mean, that's the kind of implication that we're talking about here. So it's very strange. Back to mysteries. There's this, of course, the correlation between pre and post choice photon counts that I find very interesting. And you could call it causal, retrocausal, acausal. I call it causally ambiguous because I'm not going to tell anyone what to think about cause. There's also trans-run effects. So for instance, where this run, when I say this, I mean, let's pretend there's a now. In the now run, how many photons are being emitted actually depends on what the next, after you turn off the lamp and then you turn it on again, what the next run duration is. That's statistically reliable trans-run effects. As you would imagine, if you actually have a retrocausal system that has some kind of decay from the future. There's also oscillations in the effect with day and night and with seasons, which is super cool and weird, and I hate it, but I also love it. And I have an idea about it. And then there's the real-time use question. So, of course, an obvious question is, if you go back to this idea, this recording the data, what about analyzing the data before you make the choice, right? So that's an interesting question. And here we go. So help needed. So not a physicist. And here's this phenomenon that doesn't go away. And that's been replicated by someone who had much better equipment and did it for a year. So here's what I ask you. These are a bunch of different interpretations of quantum mechanics that admit some kind of retrocausality. They wouldn't necessarily all call it retrocausality, but some kind of playing with information, time symmetry, acausality, superdeterminism. Anyway, transactional interpretation, two-state vector formalism, causally symmetric Bohm model, relational block world, two-time boundary value model, superdeterminism, and Lagrangian models, which is a joke that I put them together because Sabine Hassenfelder would hate that, and gravitational collapse, which we heard about from Roger Penrose. I'm sort of partial to relational block world and Lagrangian models and gravitational collapse, especially gravitational collapse, because there's something going on with day, night, whatever seasons. So anyway, maybe that's noise, I don't know. Thank you, everybody. So my point here was I need help figuring this out. Like which model actually could support what we're seeing in nature? So many times the physics theorists I talk with are like, no, I like my model best. And it's like, well, I'm giving you some experimental evidence. Tell me which model actually can explain this. And models that can't, assuming that you believe me and that you believe that this has been replicated, models that can't need to maybe be adjusted. I'm not saying like right now, maybe you need more data from more people, you probably do, but we can start to think about it. Whoops, wrong direction. So thanks everyone at Science of Consciousness and my funders, and especially experiment.com, which is a really cool place to do crowdsourcing of experiment funding, which this one was crowdsourced from which this one was crowdsourced. And a bunch of my research teams, especially also Winthrop Williams. And yeah, I think I don't have to read the whole list, but you get the point. Thank you very much. I don't know if we have time for questions.
I have one question for you. So on your day-night cycling, you said that was driving you towards the gravitational collapse. Do you see any tidal cycles? I would expect the tidal forces from the moon. If you're being influenced by the gravitational field, you would see that temporal
Well,
signal
yeah,
as well.
that goes with day night, right? So it's
Well, no, because the moon,
oh, the moon is going, yeah,
the moon's
no.
orbiting around the Earth, so
Yeah, that may
it
be some of
shifts
the
every day,
noise.
right? It changes every day.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
So
like the tide tables. You could look at the tide tables and see what that cycle is like.
yeah, there's so much noise because of these trans run effects, and the order you can't determine, or else it's not a good experiment. So there's so much noise, and also so much variation on a bunch of different time scales that is essentially seems like noise, but it's not noise. That is hard to answer, but it's probable if that gravitational collapse is correct, right? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
A couple of questions, Julia. First of all, just a comment. Some of those interpretations may be equivalent. Some of you may not have to look at each one individually.
I'm not going to be looking at them. Are you kidding me? I don't know how to. Here's what I know, that those are interpretations that could potentially apply.
I think some of them are equivalent. Anyway,
Okay.
a couple of questions. One, do you think the effect that you're seeing in terms of the counts versus the bunching and size, do you think that's an effect of the photons or of the apparatus? And the second question may be related. You see an overall kind of slide of when you do the count number versus on your
Not always. Yes, I
Yeah, but-
originally thought that you did, and I started thinking, oh, time is actually going in reverse, and you get more photons at the beginning.
Right.
But that's not the case for all of them. And
So what maybe you can, if you can make some conjectures of why you see this decline.
so what I can tell you is that sometimes it even goes up, Daniel. So yeah, so it's really not consistent. I'm showing you 3 experiments of like a billion, and they go in different directions, and I don't know why. And also, I think I know why, which is that I think there's this oscillatory relationship between, and I think this answers your first question in terms of photon versus system. There's this oscillatory relationship between sort of an exhaustion and a ramping up phase of the photomultiplier. And you can see it in the hysteresis, and you can also see it on a micro scale too. So it's sort of the overall mean hysteresis, but also like within a day you can see it. And so that complicates the issue. Yeah, yeah.
Enjoyed your presentation. On the gravitational collapse approach.
Yeah.
Some food for thought. Well-known economists, astronomers, and other scientists for the last 200 years have correlated tidal gravitational influence on a wide variety of geophysical features. They tend to be disregarded because nobody has a mechanism.
Yeah.
It's also worth noting, I think in 1955, Frank Brown, who was a chronobiologist, one of the leading chronobiologists of all time, took oysters in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, and plotted the data of when they opened their shells to feed and when they closed their shells. And then he took those same oysters, put them in a big aquarium and drove them to Chicago, and then put them in his lab, and they were in dark free running conditions. And over a period of about a week, they changed the time of day that they were opening and closing their shells. And it directly correlated with the difference in the gravimetric timing of the gravimetric tide as the Earth rotated.
Yeah, there's got to be some mechanism for that, and this could have a story to tell about that.
Right, and then there's recent studies that show that the cycling of mood in bipolar patients is correlated with the phases of the moon.
Yes.
So there's something going on there.
There's something going on there.
Yeah, I don't know whether retrocausality would have anything to do with it.
Me neither.
But it might.
Or photons. Right. I mean, it's all very unclear. And I just want to reiterate, people often tell me, like Daniel just did, and you just did, about these physical phenomena that could potentially explain this. And I just want to reiterate, I literally am looking for someone who's willing to go through because I'm not going to learn the math I need to learn to go through these. Like, I'm looking for a collaborator who will literally go through these with me. And I can say, is this going to explain this or not? Because
yeah, I'm looking for a collaborator too, because I don't understand the mathematics, but I'm happy to give you, the results of my research.
Yeah, no, that's great. I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. All right, our next speaker is Ronald Gruber from Stanford University. And he's going to be talking to us about an information gathering and utilizing system, IGUS, robot to solve the 2 times problem.
Thank you. Can we get the first slide, please? Or do I just click it forward? The problem is basically that there's a gap between the physics and the neuroscience of time, one considering it somewhat dead sometimes, and the other concerned about its whether or not it's an illusion or real, and discuss how the IGUS view of Jim Hartle began to solve the problem, information gathering utilizing system. But then my colleagues and I would like to add a dualistic mind view, indicating that there are 2 systems in the brain, one from physics that we already have if we take a look and see that it's really there, and that it, by evolution and natural selection, begot an illusory system for better adaptation. So maybe it's not so much a problem at all. But it all began, as you know, with Einstein's comment, the past, present, future are only illusions, even if stubborn ones. And we've been talking about that in all the disciplines for a long time. And that's been a lot of fun in the controversy. There's an interesting paper that's just come out about a month ago to epitomize this whole thing, and it was put very nicely by Robelli and Buonamano. On the one hand, Robelli said that we can attribute the flow of time, that's the mystery, the illusion, to perhaps entropy. And Buonamano said, well, wait a minute, maybe we should look at the block universe or its modifications, and maybe it really hasn't been tested. A quick definition about illusion, we use it a little bit loosely. Strictly speaking, of course, it's whatever is contradicted by physics, but in talking about this topic, it's illusion is often used to refer to items that are outside of physics, qualia. Anything that physics that doesn't pertain to physics would be put in that category. So in 2005, Jim Hartle, who did a number of nice projects with Stephen Hawking on the black hole, proposed that we humans are basically a model robot, and we could have become one of a number of robots to gather rather, and utilize information in such a way that we would view the past, present, and future. And then what he had is this little schematic here where information coming in, say from a deck of cards, would go through a series of these registers from P1 to Pn, eventually go to a processing center that's unconscious. This is a very loose way of thinking about it, of course. Go through a schema, go through a consciousness processing center before eventually emitting various types of behavior. And one of the robots, he said, that could have developed but didn't, but we could artificially make it, but it would be consistent with physics, is the split screen robot, where basically we would see the present and maybe the recent past in a split screen format. So when he came out with that paper in 2005, my colleagues and I decided to take him up on it and make the virtual reality apparatus that he suggested. This is it, with some base stations so that the robot and the person knows where he is at all times, with the computer in the backpack. And it was fascinating because you go back in time, see yourself, kind of like a replay, but unlike a football replay, you're there. And it's freaky because you really feel you're there and you can move around. And of course, you can't interact with the items that you're looking at, but the experience is very, very real. And you press a button, you come back to the future. Unfortunately, we couldn't duplicate the SS robot. Why? Because there was no immersion. That's one of the properties of VR. However, by being an intermittently behind robot, an IB robot, that qualified as one of Hartle's robots and confirmed his hypothesis, and he was very happy about that. The whir line for that is quite simple. You see it on the right there. So information from CARD would come in at one point on the whir line and be experienced again later on the whir line. So it all made sense, and it indicated that we could have the same present more than once, and the two people might see two observers would see two different presents. Most everybody I know is very satisfied with that. But there's a lot of other aspects to the flow of time. And so we got involved with what's called the dualistic mind view, saying essentially that there are two temporal systems. There's a veridical system. And we discovered various components of it that we sort of ignore. They're really there when you think about them, whether they're duration, judgment, or temporal order. But there's also a corresponding illusory system, part of which is the flow of time and all the things that cause experiential flow, that are there for the purposes of better adaptation. And most animals do not have that system, unfortunately for them. So what we did basically is augment the Hartle robot. So did Callender, the noted philosopher, and Ismail. And the idea is to put a lot more into the robot than is already there in order to handle all the issues. I want to go through just three of them that belong to manifest time, which is really the larger entity of the flow of time. So the first one we discussed earlier, whether there's an objective experience of non-unique present, but we humans have an illusory experience of a moving present. And from that, it begets the phenomena of persistence, after all. How can you move through from future to present to past if you're not a singular entity with some notion, experience of persistence? Now, coincidentally, other disciplines have been talking about the illusions of persistence and how that phenomena gives us humans the feeling of being a human, somebody with a persona, a long history. We're not just living in the present moment. And so the Bruce Hood has an entire book devoted to it. Sue Blackmore has talked about the illusion of continuity. And in addition to that, you have Tulving's mental time travel. I know you're familiar with that, in which we humans, unlike most animals, can run back and forth to the past or go into the future. And that helps provide us with our personality. It's what makes us humans. And again, most animals do not have it. And we lose it if we have a hippocampal lesion, such as a So we went back to the VR apparatus, and here you see a gentleman who had pressed the button to go back a couple minutes in the past, and look at an electronic dog that was walking around on the floor. So in the past, he would see the dog to his right, but when he pressed the button to go back to the present, immediately, suddenly, the dog is to his left. So what does he conclude? He concludes that the dog can't be the same dog. He lost confirming the illusion of object persistence. And it's no different than when you think of the tunnel experiment. After all, if when a car goes into a tunnel, a long tunnel, and if it were to come out immediately, you would say that it's not the same car. The second component I want to share with you is part of what we call completed change and dynamic change, and that is completed movement and dynamic movement, one of which is motion. Our brains do have completed movement when we look at a series of stimuli that are widely separated, but when they're shortly separated, it's motion. And of course, everybody is aware of Christoph Koch's continuous wagon wheel illusion, which is to demonstrate that visual perception is discrete and carry with it the idea that motion is really painted on, so to speak, sort of as a cerebral add-on. So that's what's going on with that. The third one we don't talk about too much, the philosophers do, and then that's the business of temporal order versus temporality. Specifically, it's the difference between what we call sequentiality and succession. And going back all the way up to the first of the 20th century, the father of psychology came out with a statement, and it's been true ever since for most everybody. The experience of succession is not the same as the succession of experiences, to indicate the difference between the more real and the less real or illusionary view of temporality, the before-after experience. And the example they would give, the Gedanken experiment, was a clock in which the second hand has sort of a feeling of succession and sequentiality every time it passes a tick, but the hour hand does not have any feeling of succession, but when it passes a tick, eventually there is an experience of sequentiality. So the last year we just came up with something that isn't even a little better example of how we can dissociate the illusory experience of succession from the more real, concrete sequentiality. We have two sounds you're going to hear now. When they're rapid, they're going to evoke succession, but as they get wider and wider apart, it's going to be lost. Let me press on it. Is there a way I can? We talked about getting this video start, this audio started when I hit the. No way to do it? No, start at the beginning, please, or can, if you can. Okay, let me back up. One more time. There we go. Okay, so what happens when we get out to 3 seconds, or what some people call our specious present or nounness? That's when we get outside of that, we lose all of these experiences of flow and dynamism, whether it's motion, and in this case, it's succession, change, dynamic change disappears. They all disappear when you get outside of that, basically a 3-second zone. So the question is, why do we need to try to reify the flow in terms of entropy when we really have no evidence to suggest that at this time? It's a hypothesis. And why do we need to try to denigrate any variation of the block universe or modern cosmology, space-time cosmology, when we can accept it? We can accept both in a dualistic manner. I would say finally that the time of physics does exist in our cranium. It has come in there at some point, and we begot through evolution and natural selection a separate illusory system that serves us very well. So the 2 times problem, in our opinion, is really more the 2 times phenomena. Thank you very much.
The floor is open for questions. I'll go ahead and start. So you mentioned that the animals don't have this capacity, and that it's an evolutionary mechanism. What do you think is the selective advantage, and what is the evidence that the animals don't have this phenomena?
The evidence for that is largely in experiments that have been done with, for example, the mirror experiment for animals when they see themselves in the mirror. Typically, not always, typically they might react with a very angry behavior because they don't see that as themselves. And mental time travel, same thing. A dog is said not to realize that he has a whole history all the way back to when he was a puppy. Now, not all animals live in the present. There are many, many research projects on that, but clearly the human has evolved, we think. The human has evolved to get completely away from being stuck in the present, which is what physics would have us be otherwise.
The sense of the selective advantage.
Is it a selective advantage to have time illusions? Absolutely. I mean, we could live without motion, for example. And what we've done is, for example, a hunter, and there are a couple people, one of which coincidentally was Oliver Sacks, the famous neurologist. There are a couple of people who, when, let's say a bird runs across your environment and you're a hunter and you want to get your dinner, it'll be sort of a stroboscopic effect. So you can still function, but clearly having motion where the brain fills in the gaps, kind of like the way we fill in the gap for our optic nerve problem. We would otherwise have a blind spot if we didn't fill in that part. So motion is clearly, it's an aesthetic to have it, like, but it's an important aesthetic.
After hearing your talk, I thought a lot about the research that was done using different animals such as crows and how they respond to music. Because to me, especially with the beats that you did, it's like picking up music notes. And what they did with the crows was, and all these other different animals, is to like determine whether they can interpret, understand, and respond to music. Oftentimes, most animals don't respond at all. It's just like noise in the background. And with crows, it's they do respond. So I was wondering if because for me, music does relate to time. So how would you interpret that? The crows being also dancing.
The crows are the best example of having this ability, and the experiments that indicate that crows are not so stuck in time and think about the future. We haven't got time to talk about all that, but yeah, crows are the one species that can think a little bit about the future. It's a complicated experiment. Very good. But most animals cannot do that, and that's just a fact. Is music important for some of them? Sure. Some of the birds do chirp music, and it's often a way of communicating with other birds, particularly to get a mate. So yes, they have an idea about music. It's a primitive idea, and they have rhythm. Rhythm is a form of succession. Did you notice in that sound clip I played for you, you had a succession, and more so, you had a rhythm, which then was lost, even though you knew that one note followed the other, and you knew the interval between them. You knew all the information you needed to know to function, but you didn't have the rhythm. But you don't really need the rhythm unless you choose to have a rhythm as a means to acquire a mate.
One more question, please.
Hey, I was just thinking, so do you think that if you increased your working memory, you might increase your species?
Increase which memory, Julia?
Your working memory? Your
working memory.
That you could increase your species presence so that in fact you wouldn't lose succession?
You wouldn't lose success. Would you lose succession if you increased your working memory?
Would you fail to, in other words, if you increase your working memory, are you increasing your species present? Or
how would you increase your species present?
Yeah.
I don't know of any study. I've been looking and looking for it, of how we can increase our species present. It is said that the football player from the 49ers way back when could spot his receivers up to 7 seconds later and throw the football on that basis because he had it all in him. Most of us, we have about 3 seconds and we kind of know where things are. And that was supposed to be the reason he was a famous football player. But there have been no experiments that I know of, and no means I know of, to increase the species present. But it would be wonderful, Julia.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That was great. Okay, our next presenter is Behrouz Raadnasab from Cosmo Intel Incorporated. And he'll be speaking to us about introducing the mental body in matter based on experimental evidence.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for your time today joining this session. I'm Behrouz Raadnasab, and I'm here today to talk about introducing the mental body in matter based on experimental evidence.
Give us 1 second to get the slides up on the screen here.
Sorry. So the matter of mind, I lost it here. Okay, just that one. So the matter of mind. Mind is a concept that has always been fascinating and perplexed the human beings due to the inner perceptual nature of the mind. Its existence is self-evident to human. However, there are so many questions that are unanswered, and they're how it comes to the being and what's its nature. Based on the most theories in mind philosophy, only human beings are considered to have mind. In other studies, animals are also considered to have mind. And in some other studies, the mind is considered as a universal property of matter. Recent theories, however, they have no empirical basis, and scientists are so far, they're trying to find a way to test it. According to one of the theories presented by Mr. Tyree, not only the mind as one of the numerous existential body of the human, but also as a part of the brain, but the function of the brain and governing the management of the mind. Mind is a software administrator, and all the existential dimensions of human being is managed by the software in various divisions of human existence in their entirety, including cellular function, management of memory, learning, and recall faculties. Based on his theory, there is a consciousness that we call it here, cosmic consciousness network. To differentiate it between the other definitions of consciousness, we call it T consciousness, which is one of the main constituents of the universe. It's neither matter nor energy, and all of them, energy, matter, and consciousness, based on this theory, can be converted to each other. So in this study, we are trying to investigate the mechanism and effects of TCF, the T consciousness fields, on the properties and behavior of material based on the obtained results in several previous physics experiments designs. In one of them, in our study, using the vibrating sample magnetometer VSM, the magnetic properties of nickel and alumina samples under influence of TCF were evaluated. So as you can see on the table, the first one for nickel, we had it under the treatment for 7 days. And after 3 days after the termination of TSF, we ran VSM testing. And you can see that Ni0 is a control sample and Ni1 are the test samples. And we could see 6% increase in the magnetic properties. In the case of alumina, we had it under the treatment for 14 days. And 7 days after the termination of TSF, we saw 35% decrease in magnetic properties. In the other study, we had the behavior of ST37 steel specimens under the tensile test with and without the TCF. I'm not going to go over the fixtures of this experiment. Everybody knows, not everybody, but most people. And the result of that study showed that we had a decrease, if you see the table below, we had a decrease, a significant decrease in Young modulus, from 215, 240, to all the way to 15 and 40, 45. Just to know that this happens in high temperatures for steel. It's like 600, 800s in normal conditions. The other thing that was noticeable on this chart was, although the Young modulus dropped, we didn't lose the ultimate strength of the specimens. So they were all in the same range. No significant changes up there. After all these studies and results, we had three possible causes. Cause one, do consciousness fields have decreasing or increasing effect on the energy of the matter? Results revealed that magnetization behavior of nickel and alumina in room temperature, even 3 and 7 days after the termination of TCF treatment, was equivalent to the behavior of temperature in about -133 and 500 degrees Celsius, respectively, while there were no high or low temperature effects were observed in the structure of the materials. In addition, the behavior of ST37 steel specimens under tensile test, even 4 days after termination of the TCF treatment, was equivalent to the behavior of temperature range of 600 to 800 degrees Celsius. Again, no high temperature effects were observed on the samples. According to the results, change in the magnetic and mechanical properties of the samples took place without the need to give or take energy. Possible cause number 2, do CFs have effects on the structure of matter? That's the other thing we were investigating. The crystal structure of the nickel is typically 4-center cube FCC. Under a certain manufacturing process at high temperature, hexagonal closed pack HCP crystal structure can also be feasible for nickel. However, it should be noted that magnetization capabilities of nickel in form of HCP crystals are weaker than FCC form. Since the magnetization saturation of nickel under CF treatment has increased, the crystal structure of nickel cannot be changed to HCP in this set of experiment. In the case of alumina, one may assume that the crystal structure of alumina has changed from alpha structure. Same with the ST37, one may assume that the crystallinity structure and microstructure of steel has changed from alpha to gamma. However, these structures are unstable, and after the termination of the treatment, the crystal structure of alumina and steel must return to the structure of the control samples. But even several days after the termination of the consciousness field exposure, the changes in the properties and behavior of alumina and steel were observed, and they were stable. It can be concluded that consciousness field did not change the structure of the matter in any of the experiments we conducted. Possible cause number 3. Did consciousness field change the behavior of material by changing their mental state? Based on the result of the recent experimental studies, instead of focusing on what the matter is, we focus on the role and function of mind in matter. The concept of mind at the material level is proposed considering the following points and cases. For material to be able to exhibit different properties and behaviors under the influence of a consciousness field, they must have a mental body in addition to the physical body, which is the matter and energy of constituents. The mental body of matter includes A, information, and B, data of other mental states. The information includes the formation of each component of the system, the process of formation, and all its equilibrium and non-equilibrium states. The other mental states have been formed during the process of formation of matter and while reaching the existing equilibrium state. According to this theory, mental body matter, the function of mental body of the matter is to maintain the information, to interact with the consciousness field, to accept new mental state, and also to exhibit behavior appropriate to a new complex mental state. The mental body of matter comprises the information of each component of the system, process of formation, and all its equilibrium and unbalanced state, and the mental state constructed during the process of formation of matter and balanced state. To give it a better example, here is what this theory says. So physical body mental body gets data and information from physical body. It's input from environment. It's going to be like magnetic field, cold, hot, etc. And that can transform to a mental state using mental body. It applies the appropriate mental state to that condition. Similarly, the same information can be transferred using a consciousness field, doing the same thing. You give the mental body the same information and the same mental state will be applied. It will trigger the same mental state, and physical body will show that behavior, will get that behavior, assumes that behavior. And that was the main goal of this study, to show that such a thing happens, and we wanted to show that this is not a matter of energy or changing the structure of the matter, but it is a kind of information that you can transfer using that theory. Thank you all. That was it.
Thank you. Could you explain what, I didn't quite get the experiment. What is the source of the TCF that you're exposing the material to? How do you focus it?
So this is a technique introduced by Mr. Tyree. So you are able to use that consciousness field. So, and you can only do it in a laboratory.
Only in a laboratory?
Only in a laboratory.
Okay. And how do you do it?
It's a technique that you can go to that website and you get more information.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a procedure that you can do it in the lab.
Okay.
Anybody can do it.
All right. We can't hear you. The last slide, put the last slide back up.
Oh, sure.
Okay, our next speaker is Margaret Schick. Is Margaret here?
Yep, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Or online?
Yes, I'm online.
You're online, wonderful.
Okay, and you can hear me? Can you?
Yep, let me finish introducing you. She is from Soulful Wellness, and she's going to be presenting Regression Hypnosis as a tool for exploration of Chiron, the wounded healer in the natal chart. And we hear you, and we have your slides up.
Perfect, thank you. Thanks very much to the coordinators of this conference for accepting my presentation proposal and for providing to me this opportunity to share some of my observations. I appreciate the different perspectives and approaches to consciousness that have been presented here this week. This presentation of mine is not one of rigorous science. This is a presentation of a hypothesis or hypotheses in the making. And a little background on me and my work. I come from a family of engineers, and I majored in biology as an undergrad. So respect for science was encouraged in me from a young age. 5 years ago, I opened a private practice that I call Soulful Wellness, through which I do astrological consultation, regression hypnosis, and Reiki healing. I recognize that astrology is not a science, but I want to say that it is not a science yet, or at least that astrology has a role to play in understanding the science of consciousness. This is what I will briefly and very quickly cover in this presentation: astrology as a tool of individuation with a focus on Chiron, the wounded healer, exploration of Chiron through regression hypnosis, and those hypotheses in the making. I think I'll skip this just to be quick. This is the first time I've attended the Science of Consciousness conference, and it's been great to see and hear so much discussion of cosmic consciousness, and especially about the hard science of it. What it comes down for me is this, that consciousness or objective psyche exists outside of the body and originates in the universe. Astrology is a language and a form, an art form that bridges cosmic consciousness and human experience. Astrology has also been around for thousands of years. Astrology provides an intricate framework for understanding the complexities of personality and the psyche. And I'd like to appeal to any scientist who has never even dared to consider the validity of astrology in saying that it's important that we differentiate between the generalist horoscopes that we see in newspapers and magazines, or some pop astrologers need to create a sense of fatalism around something like a Mercury retrograde. I like to say it this way, that those horoscopes are to real astrology as French fries are to the whole of French culture. Not even French, not a credible representation of the vast and intricate tool that is astrology. Real astrology is used responsibly, and it is an incredibly helpful tool for promoting personal growth. So I'd like to give a quick and very simplified overview of how a natal chart is interpreted, just to demonstrate the complexity that it holds. This chart, or zodiac, is essentially a map of the celestial bodies and points as they were positioned in the sky on the date and time and location of a person's birth. It's charted from a geocentric perspective. So here is the sun, for instance, in its position in the sky at the time that this person was born, according to its apparent path around the earth. These glyphs here in between the red lines are symbols for the planets, the sun and the moon, some asteroids, and some mathematically derived celestial points that are not actual material celestial bodies, but which still have significance in astrology. Each of these bodies is like an actor on the stage of your life. The role that they play is the same in everyone's life. For instance, the sun describes our overarching approach to life, and it correlates to how we recharge our energy when we're feeling depleted. The moon, as another example, describes how we process emotional experience and how we naturally attend to our self-care. These glyphs are symbols for the 12 astrological signs, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, etc., which describe psychological behaviors that we've assigned to these 12 different constellations. Each of these describes the way in which the planets, sun, moon, and asteroids play their distinct roles. So, for instance, with the sun in the sign of Pisces, this says that this person approaches life in a fairly fluid fashion, and solitude and attunement to their spiritual nature re-energizes them. There are 12 30-degree sections of the zodiac, which we call houses, each of which describes an area of life in which we experience ourselves, such as home, work, and society, in exploration of philosophical ideas, in development of our belief systems, through creativity, as part of a group, or through spiritual connection. And finally, the blue and red lines at the center are called aspects, and they describe the qualities and energies of the celestial bodies and points as they interact with each other, correlating to areas in the personal psyche where we have natural gifts and flow, and areas where we experience internal conflict and struggle, eventually leading to psychospiritual growth as we mature. But how to explain the correlation between planetary positions and psychological experience? The correlation and coincidences are positively uncanny. This is why I have a passion for astrology. But this also has been a problem for me as someone who is science-minded. Prominent astrologers explain this correlation of planetary position and psychological experience as beautiful synchronous patterning, and I love this explanation. And I have to say that after many years of studying astrology and doing hundreds of readings, I don't need science to validate what I do. My work validates itself, but still, It bothers me. Is the correlation acausal? Is it a result of synchronous patterning? Or is it causal? Will science one day explain this patterning? A particular favorite celestial body of mine in my readings is Chiron, the wounded healer. Chiron orbits between Saturn and Uranus. It has properties of asteroid and comet. In astronomy, it's known as a centaur because it has both of these properties. In Greek mythology, Chiron is the wounded healer, and Chiron is depicted as a centaur, half horse, half human. In astrology, we interpret Chiron as a wound passed down through ancestral lineage. It may also be a wound that was experienced in a past life or past lives. It's a wound that the soul strives to heal in this life, and it's a healing gift that we share with others. The Chiron wound manifests in different ways in different people. For example, insecurity around basic survival, finding self-worth in others' approval, a fear of change, feelings of vulnerability at home or in one's body, timidity around using one's voice, debilitating perfectionism, recurring difficulty in personal relationships, difficulty finding one's social tribe or like-minded groups, or a fear of asserting boundaries. What's most important about Chiron is that it gets in the way of our ability to be our most authentic selves. If we can recognize and validate the wound as significant, then as a significant barrier to our individuation, and if we can begin to heal the wound, then life becomes all the more fulfilling and authentic because it is something that we associate with generational trauma and past lives. Many of my clients early on in my practice asked how they could learn more about their Chiron. So I went through regression hypnotherapy training and certification to be able to offer my clients a way of exploring Chiron and other archetypes in their natal charts in great depth. And this work has been the most profound thing I've done in my life. Regression is a relaxing and beautifully insightful form of hypnosis through which the regressed client transitions from waking consciousness to deeper and/or exterior levels of consciousness. Under hypnosis, we become an observer of our own psyche. During hypnosis, the psyche brings forward what is most useful to the client at that time. My clients' experiences can be vastly different. Some people spend their whole regressed period, which typically goes for an hour or more, in a beautiful grassy field, reconnecting with their natural essence. Or some visit the homes of ancestors and receive messages of love and support. Some visit past lives and begin to better understand long-standing patterns of negative behavior. And some people soar in and amongst the cosmos. Many clients break into sobs of joy, gratitude, and profound love for all that is. Some common statements that they make are, everything is just as it is meant to be. We are all one. Everything is one. I keep a client's natal chart next to me while they're going through their regression. I'm not directing their experience. I'm only guiding and witnessing their experience. It's amazing to see them unintentionally explore areas of their psyche that correlate to the arrangement of the planets in their natal chart. What's been particularly notable and fascinating to me is that exploration of and insights about the Chiron wound, as represented in the natal chart, is most often the primary regression experience clients seem to have, whether or not this was the client's stated intention for the regression experience. So these are the fragments of a hypothesis or hypotheses that are ruminating around in my brain. Astrology and regression hypnosis are tools for accessing cosmic consciousness, that is, the consciousness or objective psyche, which exists outside of the body and originates in the universe. Through connection with cosmic consciousness, regression hypnosis can be used very effectively for deep exploration of the archetypal characteristics in our natal charts, and perhaps most effectively for exploration of the asteroid comet, the centaur Chiron, and its associated archetype of the wounded healer. If we are children of the universe, since Earth and the other planets were formed from debris resulting from the Big Bang, and humans evolved from Earth matter, and we are generated from molecules that originated in the universe, then perhaps there are correlations between differences in neuronal organization in different human brains and the organizational differences in one person versus another's psychospiritual map, known as the natal chart. So next steps. I plan to pursue these questions in greater detail in my coursework and research through the PhD in depth psychology program that I'll begin in the fall through Pacifica Graduate Institute. My overall goal will be to promote greater awareness of the practice of astrology as a powerful tool for understanding and advancing one's individuation, especially when coupled with regression hypnotherapy as a tool for interfacing with cosmic consciousness, specifically for the purpose of healing psychospiritual wounding. And if you have any feedback from me, I would love to hear from you. You can contact me through my website, peggyschick.com, or by email at peggyschick@gmail.com. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. Are there any questions? I have one. So you're using the centaur object Chiron. It seemed pretty prominent. And as an astronomer that's been involved in naming these objects, I'm curious what power we're giving it when we give it a name. So there's lots of objects in the centaur population, right? And Chiron is the first one and the most prominent one. The asteroid mission that I lead, we just named, we named the asteroid in 2013 Bennu after the mythological heron from Egypt. And, you know, we're inspired to name those based on the themes of our programs and the area of the solar system that we find them in. But then you seem to find deep meaning in them. So I've never considered that aspect of naming an astronomical object when we're considering you know, especially small bodies, of which there's hundreds of thousands of them, yes. And we discover more all the time.
That is a really good question. And it's a fascinating topic. And that's actually something I thought would make a really good book sometime. I think it's a matter of synchronicity, and that may sound crazy, but there are times, you know, when Pluto was discovered, there were very plutonic energies happening around the planet at that time. So I don't have a good answer except to say that it seems like some pretty magical coincidences and synchronicities that the two come together, and the naming by astronomers happens to match the characteristics that astrologers are beginning to recognize as they work with clients, as they explore what these new discoveries mean and what kinds of psychological qualities we can attach to the newly discovered body. So, yeah.
And we do have another question here.
So first of all, I'm pleased to see that the Science of Consciousness Conference has actually been willing to put on a concurrent presentation dealing with astrology. I think that's a big step. Secondly, I commend your insight because I do think that there is a scientific explanation for astrology. It's one of the things that I've been pursuing quietly. And I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the relationship between the planets, primarily through the tidal gravitational forces of the larger system, have an effect on social mood. And that can be easily measured, for example, by the stock market. And notably today, April 22nd, 5 planets, along with the sun, aligned in a very tight 20-degree arc, which is happening right now. And that's a rare phenomena. Statistically, it's, I think, typically a fraction of a percent of the time that you have that kind of alignment, which means that the tidal forces are additive. And so right now we are experiencing an unusual level of tidal gravitational forcing on the planet and in theory on our brains. And then notably today, the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 980 points. So again, that's anecdotal evidence. We don't have a mechanism, but we sure need to be looking a little bit more carefully at it. And I think that astrologers need to move closer towards scientists, and scientists need to move a little closer to astrologers. So thank you.
Thank you. I couldn't have said it better myself. I agree 100%. Feel free to contact me and we can talk further. I love that.
Thank you, Peggy.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, our next talk is from Donald Mender. Donald, are you online?
Yes, I am.
All right, Donald is at Yale University, and he's going to be talking to us about the qualitative thermofield.
I'll be proposing one thing, which I call the qualitative thermofield in response to the challenge. The qualitative thermofield extracts the physical formulas of proteins and unbroken symmetry to address metaphysical questions raised by the purely mechanistic thermofield theory of Kumasawa and his successors. Specifically, the qualitative thermofield invokes monological symmetry breaking, the brain consciousness, the vacuum, invokes important concepts. Such a model requires reconciliation with an unbroken symmetry implied by qualitative complete physics, mandating that physical laws remain unaffected by transformation quality. The qualitative thermofield reconciles the broken symmetry of the conscious vacuum and the unbroken
Of causally complete physics through a quantized take on arousal processes. The shortcomings of emergentism offer an entry point into the prospect of qualitative thermofield theory. Emergentism relies on analogies to statistical physics and informs mainstream cognitive neuroscience. However, emergentism is plagued by a key flaw. All the macro observables, for example, temperature and pressure of statistical thermodynamics, though distinct from dynamical micro observables, such as the energy and momentum of individual material particles, are nevertheless physical, whereas consciousness cannot be assumed to be physical without begging the following core metaphysical question. How can consciousness be reliably related to physics if independent physical objects may not even exist? Instead, conscious qualia might refer in a semantically holistic fashion only to those other qualia subsumed within a given solipsistically windowless sensorium or monad. To address this problem, consciousness should be neither mistaken for a physically emergent macro thing, analogous to the temperature or pressure of a gas, nor erroneously reduced to physically real micro objects. In particular, to link nodes in a neural network presumed analogous to colliding billiard ball-like gas molecules. Instead, consciousness should be thought of as a metaphysical vacuum containing no ontologically real physical things or objects at all. This model of consciousness as a metaphysical vacuum can be visualized through analogy to a physical system. Within the illustrated energy landscape, A ball perched on a symmetrical hill's summit is disposed by gravity to roll down the hill in an infinite number of equally possible radial directions. However, the ball, once started down a single actual path toward a particular place in the vacuum-like gutter, must break the hilltop symmetry. Through the known generic equivalence between symmetry and disorder, one can extrapolate from this concrete physical system to more abstract notions of metaphysical symmetries broken by conscious vacua. Consider that no specific physical state among very many possible candidates, including comatose brains and a vast variety of dead matter, can be singled out as uniquely ordered by unconsciousness. However, one very small class, the symmetry-broken neural states of the sentient brain, can be singled out as ordered by consciousness. Hence, through analogy to the ball-on-hill landscape, consciousness can be reimagined as a metaphysical vacuum that sucks the wide range of physical possibilities into a limited repertoire of ordered neural patterns. Notably, this construct implies that consciousness as a metaphysical vacuum is a cause rather than an effect of broken symmetry in sentient neural systems. Unfortunately, this conclusion creates an inconvenient tension by appearing to violate the widely accepted causal completeness of physics, which rules out any mental influences upon physical events. Causally complete physics requires an unbroken species of physical symmetry, flattening metaphysical hills and valleys into a featureless plane with no preferred path across the landscape, and hence with no particular qualia or special order in which qualia might be arranged to have some privileged influence on the laws of physics. In other words, causally complete physical laws must remain invariant, that is to say, symmetrical, under interqualitative transformations of one kind of quale into another. Interqualitative transformations and the attendant symmetry of physical laws may be conceptualized by empathically imagining what it might feel like to inhabit a monad other than one's own. Each monad might be imagined to have its own semantically holistic ensemble of qualia, arranged in its own individual pattern, unique among the various permutations characterizing all possible intramonadic patterns. Moreover, in accordance with the causal completeness of physics, every referentially relational permutation, whether intramonadic or intermonadic, among qualia, might be expected to leave physical laws unchanged. The result would configure, among otherwise solipsistically windowless monads, a de facto system of law-like pseudo-windows, guaranteeing not only intra-subjective, but also inter-subjective consistency in the laws of physics. Symmetries of physical principles with respect to transformations of any kind may be sorted into two types. Global physical symmetry entails invariances under transformations that are the same in all cases. Local physical symmetry entails transformations that differ from case to case. One may imagine an empathic symmetry of physical laws under globally uniform interqualitative transformations, all governed by the same linguistic rules of human communication. One may also imagine an empathic symmetry of physical laws under locally non-uniform interqualitative transformations, flexibly varying across many life forms and hence beyond rigidly human grammar. Generally, transition from global to local physical symmetry will spawn a so-called gauge field possessing a geometrical curvature. The genesis of elastic forces on an invariably square two-dimensional rubber surface offers a simple toy example illustrated in the slide. One might expect transitions from global to local physical symmetries under interqualitative transformations to generate their own empathic gauge fields. Curvatures come in two varieties, intrinsic and extrinsic. To illustrate, one may imagine a two-dimensional surveyor at work within the surface of a sphere. The surveyor, without ever leaving her curved two-dimensional workspace, will be able to measure the intrinsic curvature of the sphere's surface through an intrinsically embedded triangle whose vertex angle sum is greater than the Euclidean value of 180 degrees. In contrast, the surveyor, unless she leaves her confined domain to work in a third spatial dimension, will not detect the extrinsic curvature of a cylinder's surface through an embedded triangle's vertex angle sum, in this latter case, equal to the Euclidean value of 180 degrees. To the extent that gauge curvatures are intrinsic, like a sphere, not extrinsic, like a cylinder, an intrinsically curved phenomenological gauge field should delimit the geometrical basis of a monad's referentially internal holism. The constructs just discussed were not quantized. We can now move on to show how quantization of metaphysics can resolve the tension developed over the course of this presentation. That tension, recapitulated, pits the unbroken interqualitative gauge symmetry of causally complete physics against the broken symmetry of the ordered sentient brain, conditioned by the metaphysical vacuum of consciousness. Formal quantization of metaphysics can provide resolution of this tension and restore metaphysical symmetry to fully unbroken status. Specifically, an interqualitative gauge field may be quantized as a wave-like superposition of possible metaphysical trajectories assigned probability amplitudes as per the slide. A complementary way of understanding metaphysical quantization brings into play statistical relations analogous to Heisenberg's physical principle of uncertainty. Such uncertainty must create analogs of physically virtual particle fields, using the analog of energy borrowed through uncertainty relations to cause the quantized metaphysical vacuum to float as per the yellow area in the slide above rather than at the 0 point. The uncertainty relations of metaphysical quantization can offset broken non-quantum symmetry introduced by the conscious vacuum ordering neurophysics and can thus assure the unbroken interqualitative gauge symmetry of causally complete physics. A quantized adaptation of the previously described energy landscape analogy illustrates the offset. Here, the non-zero virtual energy of quantized uncertainty in the vacuum state of the metaphorical gutter makes the metaphorical symmetry-broken ball vibrate probabilistically in two different ways, that is, with 2 extra degrees of metaphysical freedom. First, vibration circumferentially around the metaphorical gutter restores global symmetry. The mediator has the form of a physical Nambu-Goldstone boson, whose metaphysical analog is an essentially spontaneous linguistic particle wave. Second, vibration upward outside the metaphorical gutter, restores local symmetry. The mediator has the form of a physical Higgs boson, whose metaphysical analog is a cross-phyletically stimulated particle wave. The metaphysical analog of a Higgs-like boson, in particular, can cognitively rebalance interspecific thermodynamic accounts by dissipating coherent, symmetry-broken psychophysical order into a fully symmetrical, maximally entropic distribution of qualia across all physical life forms. Such dissipation will render the laws of physics the same for all species and thereby make physical assays useless in distinguishing the subjective qualitative experiences of different organisms. As illustrated in the slide, the dissipative effects of dishabituation, possibly Higgs-like, scramble physically coherent correlates of resting arousal states manifested via reticular activation in humans and perhaps via other channels in more distantly related life forms. The novel symmetry-restoring particle waves proposed for the quantized metaphysics of qualitative thermofield theory differ from those historically formulated for purely neurophysical thermofield constructs. Purely neurophysical thermofield theories have modeled excitations of the brain's quantum vacuum states as merely mechanistic substrates of memory-related phenomena, whose foundations omit qualia, which are thus engaged only on an ad hoc basis. This constitutes a category mistake avoided by the qualitative thermofield's recasting of transformations among qualia as fundamental. I look forward to your questions about this talk. If anyone wants a copy of the presentation's list of references from the literature, I would be very happy to receive requests at my email address, donald.mender@yale.edu.
Thank you, Donald. I think we'll move on to our final presentation. Austin, are you on? All right, we see it.
Okay. This is quickly thrown together. Unfortunately, I had some issues. This was a lot to cover. I've been looking for a mentor, so that's sort of my hope here, to find someone that would be able to help me out. This is reaching beyond the naked eye, complex projections and naturally naked singularities. Basically, we're going to start with a little bit of background on the biology, specifically lateralization of the hemispheres, and then go into the issues with what we put on our environment psychologically versus what it actually tells us. And then where that's going to go is to sort of a dissolving of everything that might be intelligible, that, well, essentially the uncertainty principle is like a barrier to the future in terms of being able to predict. So what that means is that we have to essentially accept that we know that there are going to be things that we will never know. And so that's what, and that this unknownness of the future, et cetera, is beyond even a psychological thing because of this uncertainty principle, at the very least, if not just the potential acausality related to the structure of the light cone, et cetera. And then the future work, which we'll see what that ended up being. Anyway, so these slides should probably be switched. The neurobiology here basically does this really strange thing that I am confused almost as to why we don't talk about it more, because it's so bizarre. But like the left field of vision goes to the right hemisphere only. Like the brain does strange reconfigurations of its of all the stimuli it's getting in order to make it just on one hemisphere from just the other field, and vice versa for the right and the left hemisphere. That suggests something configured about the way we're seeing things that might be more than just plain as day light comes in and we see what we see. In fact, if we were to map on a set of what are basically light cones splayed out in space, we start to see patterns that emerge with the brain biology and everything, which might mean something a little bit more scale invariant, semi-scale invariant. It's not quite invariant. Obviously, the scale is still a factor. But in the same way that a Fourier transform can decompose a time domain into a frequency domain, there might be something like that going on with the structure of time, in that it could be ladderized or stratified and be working kind of concurrently at multiple different scales, which we'll be getting to soonish. This is sort of a way to just remap space-time in the way that we're thinking. So we're used to something that's maybe more like this, where the observer is in the center of the universe because special relativity happens to be egocentric like that. And this would be the cosmic microwave background, which is basically the best evidence for the Big Bang, mostly because it has points in the sky at different places that correspond to other points in the sky, but the opposite end, and it's like the largest distance away. So how would that happen unless these things were put together at some point? But with entangled particles and the like, there, not only that, but like with blotched spheres, the mathematics of it has like dipoles just all over the place. So it's not too surprising actually to see large space correlations if there's something outside of the regular locality that we're used to. Anyway, the idea here is that there is a observer going out to the external horizon because past the Big Bang, there's nothing, or at least nothing that we know of. And then we can invert all this, literally like just inverting it, like raised to the negative first power sort of thing. And then what that does, mathematically at least, is it flips everything inside out so that now the external horizon has become the place of where the observer would be standing, and at least our representation of the space. And that inflates what the observer was into something that is now of the size of an infinite size, in accordance with the previous model, that has its own horizon. And so now we've got a dual horizon sort of thing going on, where on one end we have the beginning of time, and on the other end maybe we have the end of time, but that seems to be also where the present is. So let's see. One of the things that this shows, because it's not just like when you look out into the sky, you don't just see the sky as it is now, because everything's lens shifted for a whole bunch of reasons. You're essentially looking into the past as you go, which is how you can see the Big Bang as you look up there. And so there's this image is supposed to summarize a lot of associations one can make of direct proportionalities to each other that seem to hint at something that is more, well, this is essentially both these are the same thing. It's a surface, it's a 3D surface, or it appears to be, that collapses in with some kind of parameter that is time, but also space. So given that space and time are so linked, does it even really make sense to call one thing the other if we've got two different words and we seem to be using them differently? Why even use space for a physical space? And when we say physical space, we've got to clarify that we mean physical space or something, at least in mathematics, because there's so many hypothetical spaces we're working with. Might it all be just time out there, and that the space that we consider physical space is more of a spatial representation of time, a multidimensional time, basically, that we're sort of intersecting as we push out this this hypersurface that goes from one internal horizon to the other, to the external one. Here, this would be if we kind of go between those two different configurations. We can see how if we were to expand the internal horizon out so it becomes visible, we've got something that looks like a black hole. And then if we were to put that event horizon back in and maybe pull it out on the other edge of time a little bit too, then we got something that's more akin to a naked singularity, which has enough charge and spin to have its energy extend out to the proximity a little bit. So it's almost as if it's self energy extend out. It continuously keeps the potential to act on the present. It's harder to define the present when we're being loose with time concepts, but basically, where I was looking at all this from was, instead of assuming that the way that we see the world is the way that it is, instead thinking about it in terms of the world is my representation or even my expectation of what will happen next because of the brain has to like simulate 10th of a second into the future in order to, because it takes so long for all the pathways to work. That has to do that for predators and all that jazz. So instead of this idea of the exterior being formed, maybe the exterior isn't so formed and the form is happening inside our mind, and it's something that we're imposing onto the space, and it works until it doesn't work. And maybe at the level that it becomes noticeable that it doesn't work is more of a quantum mechanical level. And this was basically, what if we superpose those images on there? Like in quantum mechanics, you can just basically create any kind of superposition you want between two states, which is just basically a plus sign, anyway. So in this, we can see how they sort of mirror each other. And it seems to concentrate on this inflection point. Yeah, slide's a bit out of order. Oh well. Jumping up ahead, actually. So it's talking about the stratification of time. Dirac pointed out in the principles of quantum mechanics that we need to rethink causality because the way that it was being considered as differential equations didn't match the observation, because we get a quantum jump. So what is the quantum jumps jumping between? Well, they're jumping between energy levels, but what is that? What are energy levels? Well, it's just something that we say at this point. Don't really think about it too much, it seems, besides band gaps and stuff like that. There might be a way to think about it in terms of the expanding and contracting of the naked singularities and the those inversions of the of space-time in accordance with the observer's position. That essentially does the Fourier transform on space-time and breaks it out into its different frequency strata. And then that might make more sense as to how one object can affect the other. So like when we're measuring a state, it seems to be in this place of like, it doesn't know what it is yet or something. It's not formed quite yet. And then we impose at some higher level of analysis based on previous momentum, essentially, that it squashes down into one of our orthogonal basis vectors, basically.
Austin, you have a couple more minutes.
Okay. So that action and stratifying that action might help sort things out. Also, it's worth noting that Dirac was essentially suggesting this when he redefined what big and small were by what could interact with what. So I'm bigger than my glass because I can affect my glass more than my, or rather that my observation of the glass is more likely to affect my glass than my observation of the sun, for example. The sun's not going to go out because I look at it or something. And so that means it's bigger than me. And that kind of idea of a more absolute sense to scale in quantum mechanics would be the first step towards solving the measurement paradox, or whatever you want to call it. This Pali-Young quaternio, a lot of the work that I was hoping to do over the next year and last 2 years has been along what they were doing. So it turns out. The causality and synchronicity aspect seem to correspond directly to the stratification. The momentum and space-time being the conjugates of action, which goes with the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which I wanted to have a slide for, but I neglected to get that on there, I guess. So anyway, conclusions and future directions. Integration of the unknown. So behind the external horizon and the internal horizon, both parts of time are unknown to us, and so it makes sense to integrate that. In fact, maybe even consider, until we know more, that is the generator of the quote-unquote randomness in quantum mechanics' measurements, instead of us just saying that randomness is now a reasonable excuse for a theory, because randomness, just according to the ancient Greeks at least, just translates to the causes unknown. And then when it comes to the way that we seem to talk about randomness today, we don't actually mean randomness, we mean pseudo-randomness, because all the randomness that we actually exhibit with computers and stuff is all deterministic algorithms anyway, so it doesn't really make sense to use the term random. Anyway. All right, and also there was some stuff about artists that would be, because I didn't get into that at all actually, but basically the projection of imposing something of a predetermined form onto your environment has to be generated from somewhere. If the environment wasn't there to generate it in the first place, at least in its solidified form, the kind of fuzziness of things needs to be ironed out from somewhere, and so I guess that would be something like Kepler's archetypes, I guess, or maybe the world of forms, maybe Penrose's mathematical ideas. Anyway, with the three worlds, three mysteries thing, that's what I was indicating. Anyway, all right, that's about it for that, I guess.
All right. Thank you very much, Austin.
So yeah, questions, I guess. And then my email, I'll put in the chat if that's all right.
That sounds great.